The cold metal floor scraped against Jin's knees as the alien guards dragged him through the endless corridors of Sector 7. His hands were bound behind his back with energy cuffs that burned his wrists every time he moved. The guards, tall, grey creatures with 4 arms and no sense of humor, seemed to enjoy watching him struggle. "Move faster, human scum," one of them hissed through its translator device. Jin said nothing. He had learned long ago that talking to these creatures was pointless. They saw humans as nothing more than pests to be squashed. The prison ship was massive, bigger than 3 city blocks put together. Jin had been walking for 20 minutes and still hadn't seen the end of it. Pipes ran along the ceiling, carrying strange liquids that glowed green and blue. The air smelled like burned metal and something that reminded him of rotting fish. Other prisoners watched from behind force fields as they passed. Most were aliens Jin had never seen before. Some had too many eyes, others had no eyes at all. A few looked almost human, but with skin that changed colors like a mood ring. They all had one thing in common, though. They looked broken, defeated, like they had given up hope years ago. Warden Vextar was waiting at the end of the corridor. He was different from the guards, taller, with smooth purple skin and golden eyes that never blinked. His uniform was covered in medals and ribbons that probably meant he had killed a lot of people. Jin had blown up one of his weapons factories 3 weeks ago, and the warden had not forgotten. "Ah, the famous Jin," Vextar said, his voice smooth like oil. "The human who thinks he can challenge the Galactic Empire with homemade bombs and stolen ships." He walked in a slow circle around Jin, looking him up and down like he was examining a bug. "Do you know how many of my soldiers you killed in that explosion?" Jin looked straight ahead and said nothing. He had counted. 47 enemy soldiers had died when the weapons factory went up in flames. He remembered each one because he had to. That was the price of war. 53 good soldiers, the warden continued, making up his own number. 53 beings, with families and dreams and futures, all gone because one human thought he could play hero. He stopped in front of Jin and leaned down close. His breath smelled like sulfur. "Well, hero, let me show you what happens to terrorists in my prison." The warden pressed a button on his wrist device. A huge metal door started to slide open with a grinding sound that echoed through the corridor. Beyond the door was darkness, but Jin could hear something moving inside. Something big. "You see, we have a special wing for our most dangerous prisoners," Vextar explained, with a smile that showed too many teeth. "2 creatures that destroyed 3 entire star systems before. We caught them. Dragons, the humans would call them, though they are much worse than anything from your fairy tales." The guards pushed Jin toward the open doorway. He could feel heat coming from inside, like standing too close to a fire. The smell of old smoke and something that might have been burned bones drifted out. "They have been sleeping for months," the warden said, "dreaming of the worlds they burned and the billions they killed, but I think they will wake up when they smell fresh meat." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Let us see how long the great human hero lasts against real monsters." The guards shoved Jin hard and he stumbled into the darkness. The metal door slammed shut behind him with a sound like thunder. He heard the locks clicking into place, one after another. 8 different locks. Nobody was getting out of here. Jin stood still and let his eyes adjust to the darkness. The cavern was huge, bigger than a football stadium. The walls were made of black stone that seemed to absorb light. High above, small holes in the ceiling let in just enough light to see shapes moving in the shadows. And there they were. 2 massive forms lying on opposite sides of the cavern. Even sleeping, they were terrifying. Each one was the size of a school bus, covered in scales that looked like armor. Their wings were folded against their bodies, but Jin could see they would span the entire width of the cavern when spread. Smoke drifted from their nostrils with each breath. Dragons, real, actual dragons. The warden and his guards were probably watching through hidden cameras, waiting for the show to begin. They expected Jin to scream, to run around like a trapped animal, to beg for mercy that would never come. Instead, Jin walked calmly to the center of the cavern. He knelt down and began picking up small rocks from the floor, examining each one carefully before putting it in his pocket. The dragons continued sleeping, unaware that their new cellmate was already planning his next move. Jin sat down cross-legged on the stone floor and waited. He had been in worse situations before. Not many, but a few. The key was to stay calm, observe everything, and never give up hope. The show was about to begin. The first dragon opened its eyes like golden coins catching sunlight. Flamewing had been dreaming of burning cities and screaming crowds when the scent of something new filled his ancient nostrils, something small and warm and alive. His massive head lifted from the stone floor, and he looked around the cavern with confusion. There, sitting in the middle of their prison like he owned the place, was the strangest creature Flamewing had ever seen. It was tiny, barely the size of his smallest claw. It had no scales, no wings, no fangs worth mentioning. Just pale skin and dark hair and clothes that looked like they had seen better days. The creature was sitting cross-legged on the cold stone, completely still, watching him with dark eyes. That showed no fear at all. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The second dragon, Deathclaw, stirred at the sound of his partner moving. Deathclaw was older and more suspicious than Flamewing. His black scales were covered in scars from 1,000 battles, and his yellow eyes had seen the death of entire worlds. He raised his massive head and sniffed the air. "Food?" Deathclaw rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "I think so," Flamewing replied, but he sounded uncertain. "Though it smells different from the others they have thrown in here." Both dragons remembered the last prisoners the warden had fed them. Alien criminals who had screamed and run and begged for mercy before the fire consumed them. Those prisoners had smelled of fear and desperation. This small creature smelled of something else entirely, something that made both ancient predators feel oddly uncomfortable. Jin continued to sit perfectly still, his eyes moving back and forth between the two dragons. He was memorizing everything, the way their necks moved when they lifted their heads, the pattern of scales along their sides, the small gaps between their armor plates where a blade might find flesh. Most importantly, he was studying their behavior. Fascinating. Jin whispered to himself, pulling out a piece of torn fabric from his sleeve. He began scratching marks on it with a small stone, making rough drawings and notes. Flamewing appears to be the younger one, more aggressive but less experienced. Deathclaw is older, more cautious. Both show signs of intelligence far beyond animal level. Flamewing heard the human speaking and felt insulted. Here was this tiny morsel of meat, sitting in their domain, completely ignoring the fact that he was about to become lunch. The dragon's pride could not stand such disrespect. "Do you know what we are, little creature?" Flamewing growled, rising to his full height. His head nearly touched the cavern ceiling, and his wings spread wide to cast shadows across the entire chamber. "We are the destroyers of worlds. We are the nightmare that entire civilizations whisper about in the dark." Jin looked up from his notes and nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I can see that. Your fire-breathing mechanism appears to be glandular, probably connected to a secondary stomach that produces the combustible materials. Quite efficient, really. Though I notice your wing structure suggests you would have limited maneuverability in enclosed spaces like this." Both dragons stared at him in stunned silence. This was not the reaction they were used to. Deathclaw leaned forward, his massive head coming closer to the human. "Are you not afraid, small one?" "Of course I am," Jin replied calmly, still making notes. "Fear is a useful survival mechanism, but panic is not. I am simply choosing to channel my fear into observation and planning rather than screaming and running around in circles." Flamewing had heard enough. This tiny creature was mocking them with its calmness. With a roar that shook dust from the ceiling, he opened his massive jaws and breathed a stream of fire directly at the human. The fire was hot enough to melt steel. It had burned through the hulls of starships and reduced cities to ash. Any normal prisoner would have been vaporized instantly, but Jin was not any normal prisoner. The moment he saw Flamewing's throat begin to glow, Jin threw himself sideways and rolled behind a large boulder that had fallen from the ceiling years ago. The fire washed over the stone like a tide of liquid flame, but Jin emerged from the other side completely unharmed. His clothes were a bit singed, and his hair was smoking slightly, but he was very much alive. "Interesting," Jin said, brushing ash off his shirt. "The fire reaches temperatures of approximately 2,000 degrees Celsius, but the blast duration is only 4.3 seconds. And there was a 2-second delay between when you decided to attack And when the fire actually came out, that is plenty of time to take cover if you know what to look for. Flamewing stared at the spot where the human had been standing. The stone floor was melted into glass, still glowing red-hot. Nothing could have survived that blast. Yet somehow, this impossible creature was standing there, taking notes, like he was in a classroom. Your attack pattern is predictable, Jin continued, walking closer to the confused dragon. You telegraph your intentions with body language. Your fire has a limited range and duration, and you need time to recharge between blasts. A human military unit would have you neutralized in under 30 seconds. Deathclaw felt something he had not experienced in centuries. Uncertainty. This small creature was speaking with the confidence of a predator, not prey. "What are you?" Deathclaw asked quietly. Jin looked up at both dragons and smiled for the first time since entering their prison. It was not a cruel smile or a mocking one. It was the smile of a teacher who had just found two very promising students. "I am a human," Jin said simply, "and if you want to get out of this place alive, you are going to need to learn what that means." Jin walked to the nearest wall and began scratching lines into the stone with a sharp rock. The two dragons watched with growing curiosity as he drew simple figures and diagrams. They had never seen anything like this before. Most prisoners who ended up in their cavern spent their time screaming or trying to hide. This human was giving them a lecture. "Look at this," Jin said, pointing to his crude drawing of a large creature and a small one. "This is how most species think about fighting. Big creature wins because it is bigger and stronger. Simple, right?" He drew an X over the small figure. "But humans learned something different a long time ago." Flamewing leaned his massive head closer to see the drawings better. "What did you learn, small one?" "We learned that size does not matter if you can think faster than your enemy," Jin replied. He drew another picture showing the small figure, using a stick to move a large rock. "Humans have been killing creatures much bigger than us for thousands of years. Bears, lions, mammoths that were 10 times our size. We did not grow bigger claws or sharper teeth, we got smarter." Deathclaw snorted, sending a small puff of smoke into the air. "Tricks and tools are for the weak. True strength comes from power." Jin smiled and picked up a handful of small stones. "Really? Watch this." He arranged the stones in a specific pattern near the wall, then picked up a larger rock and placed it carefully on top. "This is called a deadfall trap. One small human can use this to kill something as big as you." He demonstrated by placing a stick under the balanced rock, then pulling it away with a string made from threads pulled from his shirt. The heavy stone crashed down with enough force to crack the floor. "The prey steps on the trigger," Jin explained, "and gravity does the rest. No muscles needed, no claws, just understanding how the world works and using it against your enemy." Both dragons stared at the simple trap with new respect. They had never thought about using their environment as a weapon. "But that is just the beginning," Jin continued. He moved to another section of wall and began drawing more complex diagrams. Humans also learned about pressure points. Every creature, no matter how big or strong, has weak spots. He sketched a rough outline of a dragon's body and marked several locations with X symbols. Behind the jaw here is a nerve cluster that controls balance. Hit it correctly and even a dragon will fall down. The base of the neck, where it meets the skull, has blood vessels close to the surface. Block those for just a few seconds, and the brain stops working. Flamewing unconsciously touched his neck with one claw. "How do you know this?" "Because humans study everything," Jin replied. "We take apart our enemies piece by piece, learn how they work, find their weaknesses. Then we share that knowledge with every other human. When one human learns something, we all learn it." He drew more pictures, showing groups of small figures surrounding a large one. Humans also invented something called pack tactics. "We do not fight fair, we do not fight with honor, we fight to win." Deathclaw was beginning to understand why this small creature showed no fear. "You are saying that humans are not individual fighters. You are saying you are a collective predator." "Exactly," Jin said, pleased that the dragon was catching on. "One human might not be able to defeat a dragon, but 10 humans working together, 20, 100, we become something much more dangerous than the sum of our parts." He scratched new drawings on the wall, showing various formations and strategies. Humans learned to fight in groups with specialized roles. Some carry shields to protect others. Some use long spears to attack from a distance. Some throw objects or shoot projectiles. Everyone has a job and everyone depends on everyone else. Flamewing was fascinated despite himself. But what about when you fight alone? What if there are no other humans to help you? Jin grinned and tapped his temple with one finger. Then we use the most dangerous weapon humans ever developed, psychology. He drew a simple face on the wall, then added expressions of fear, anger, and confusion. Every creature has a mind, and every mind can be manipulated. Make your enemy angry, and they make mistakes. Make them afraid, and they become predictable. Make them confused, and they defeat themselves. You are saying you can control our thoughts? Deathclaw asked, his voice rumbling with concern. Not control, Jin corrected. Influence. For example, right now you are both wondering if I am telling the truth about human capabilities. You are trying to decide if I am dangerous or just clever. That uncertainty is already changing how you think about me. Both dragons realized he was right. They were no longer seeing him as simple prey. They were seeing him as something much more complicated and potentially threatening. But the most important thing humans learned, Jin continued, is persistence. We never give up, ever. A human will chase prey for days, weeks, months if necessary. We will try one approach, and if it fails, we will try another, and another, and another, until we find something that works. He stood up and looked both dragons in the eye. I have been in this prison for 3 hours. In that time, I have learned the layout of your cavern, studied your behavioral patterns, identified your physical weak points, and begun planning 17 different escape routes. Most other creatures would still be crying or trying to dig through solid stone with their bare hands. Deathclaw felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold cavern air. What are you planning, human? I am planning to get us out of here, Jin replied simply. All 3 of us. Because I learned something else about humans. We are very good at turning enemies into allies when it serves our purpose. He walked back to his pile of collected stones and began sorting them by size and shape. The question is, do you want to learn how to think like a human? Or do you want to stay in this cave until you die of old age? Flamewing and Deathclaw exchanged glances. For the first time in their long lives, they were beginning to understand that there might be forms of strength they had never considered. Teach us, Deathclaw said quietly. Jin smiled. Now you are thinking like a human. Jin spent the next few days turning the dragon cavern into something the warden never intended it to be. A classroom, a planning room, a place where 3 very different minds began working together toward a single goal. Tell me about the walls, Jin said to Deathclaw on the second morning. He had been awake since before dawn, scratching more diagrams onto every available surface. You have been here longer than Flamewing. What do you know about how this place was built? Deathclaw stretched his ancient neck and pointed one massive claw toward the eastern wall. That section is newer than the rest. They added it after. I destroyed the original containment field by overloading it with fire. The stone there is different, softer. Jin nodded and made a note on his makeshift map. And the ceiling. Those holes that let in light. Ventilation shafts, Flamewing added, eager to contribute. They go all the way to the surface, but they are too small for us to fit through. Too small for you, Jin corrected with a smile. But not too small for someone my size. What about guard schedules? When do they check on you? The dragons had never paid attention to such details before. Why would they? They had never planned to escape, but now they began to remember patterns they had ignored for years. 4 times per day, Deathclaw said slowly. Morning, midday, evening and late night. Always 2 guards. They stay for exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Jin raised an eyebrow. You counted. Dragons have excellent memory for time, Flamewing explained. We used to hunt by tracking the movements of entire civilizations. Knowing schedules was survival. Perfect, Jin said, adding this information to his growing collection of notes. What about the door mechanism? Electronic locks or mechanical? Both, Deathclaw replied. 8 electronic locks controlled from the guard station, plus 3 mechanical backup locks that require physical keys. Jin sat back on his heels and studied all the information he had gathered. The dragons watched him work, fascinated by the way his mind processed problems. They had never seen anything like it. Where they would use brute force, he found clever solutions. Where they saw obstacles, he saw opportunities. "We need tools," Jin announced after several minutes of thought. "And we need the guards to underestimate us for a few more days." That afternoon, when the guards came for their regular check, they found something that made them stop and stare through the reinforced viewing window. Jin was sitting cross-legged on the cavern floor with dozens of carved stone pieces arranged in front of him. The pieces were different shapes and sizes, some marked with scratched symbols that looked like writing. Across from him, both dragons lay on their bellies with their massive heads lowered to floor level, studying the stone pieces with intense concentration. "Your knight can move here," Jin was saying, pointing to one of the carved stones. "But if you do that, my castle piece can attack your king from this angle. Remember, every move has consequences. Think 3 steps ahead, not just one." Flame Wing carefully moved one of his pieces with the tip of his claw. "Like this? Better," Jin said approvingly. "Now you are thinking about the whole board, not just one piece. That is strategic thinking. Apply that same logic to prison layouts, guard movements, and escape routes." The 2 guards outside the door looked at each other in confusion. This was not what they had expected to find. They had come to collect the human's bones and clean dragon droppings from the floor. Instead, they were watching the galaxy's most feared predators playing some kind of board game with their supposed meal. "Should we report this?" one guard whispered to the other. "Report what? That the human is still alive. The warden expects him to be dead by now. But look at them. The dragons are not trying to eat him. They are listening to him." The first guard pressed his face closer to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. The human was not just playing a game. He was teaching. And the dragons were learning. "He is not their prisoner," the guard whispered. "He is their teacher." They watched for several more minutes as Jin explained complex tactical concepts using the simple stone game. He talked about sacrifice moves, where you give up one piece to gain a better position. He explained flanking maneuvers and how to control the center of the battlefield. Most disturbing of all, he discussed how to turn your enemy's strength against them. The dragons absorbed every word like students in a university. They asked questions, tested theories, and practiced the concepts Jin taught them. Worst of all, they were getting good at it. The guards left without entering the cavern. They went straight to Warden Vextar's office. "Sir, we have a problem with the human prisoner," the first guard reported. Vextar looked up from his paperwork with annoyance. "What problem? Is he not dead yet? Are the dragons being slow about eating him?" "That is the problem, sir. They are not eating him. They are learning from him." The warden's golden eyes narrowed. "Explain." The guards told him everything they had seen. The stone game, the tactical discussions, the way the dragons hung on every word the human spoke. When they finished, Vextar sat in silence for a long time. Finally, the warden activated his desk monitor and switched to the hidden cameras inside the dragon cavern. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Jin had turned the cavern into a war room. Every wall was covered with diagrams, maps, and tactical plans. The human had somehow convinced 2 of the most dangerous predators in the galaxy to work with him instead of eating him. Even worse, he was teaching them how to think like humans. "How long has this been going on?" Vextar asked quietly. "We think since the first day, sir, maybe longer." The warden realized his terrible mistake. He had thought he was throwing a human to the dragons. Instead, he had given a military strategist access to 2 living weapons and enough time to plan their revenge. He had not created a prison cell, he had created a war council, and now it was probably too late to stop whatever they were planning. On the monitor, Jin looked up directly at the hidden camera and smiled. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and was very pleased with how well his plan was working. The countdown to escape had begun. At exactly 3 in the morning, when the night shift guards were at their sleepiest and the automated systems ran their daily maintenance cycle, Jin gave the signal. He had been counting seconds in his head for the past week, tracking every detail of the prison's routine with the precision of a Swiss watch. "Now," he whispered. Deathclaw moved first. The ancient dragon had spent days practicing the exact angle and intensity of flame needed for Jin's plan. Instead of his usual devastating blast that could melt steel, he produced a thin, controlled stream of fire aimed at a specific point on the eastern wall. The newer stone that Jin had identified began to glow and crack under the precise heat application. At the same moment, Flamewing breathed fire at a small pile of materials Jin had been collecting for days. Threads from his clothes, bits of organic matter from their food, and certain minerals from the cavern floor that Jin had recognized as combustible. The mixture exploded with a sharp crack that echoed through the cavern like a gunshot, but this was not random destruction. Jin had calculated the exact amount of explosive force needed to damage the wall's support structure, without bringing the entire ceiling down on their heads. The blast created a spider web of cracks that spread exactly where Jin had predicted. "They would. Phase 2, Jin called out, already moving toward the damaged wall with a makeshift tool he had carved from stone. The improvised explosives had weakened the wall, but Jin knew they needed to move fast. The blast would have triggered alarms throughout the prison. They had maybe 3 minutes before the first response teams arrived. Jin began hammering at the cracked stone with systematic precision, hitting load-bearing points that would cause maximum structural damage with minimum effort. Each strike was calculated. Each blow was placed exactly where physics and engineering knowledge told him it would do the most good. Deathclaw and Flamewing had initially been skeptical of Jin's plan. It seemed too complex, too dependent on perfect timing. But now, watching him work with absolute confidence while explosion alarms blared throughout the prison, they began to understand what human determination actually looked like. The wall gave way with a rumbling crash, revealing the corridor beyond. Jin stepped through the opening and immediately began placing small objects he had prepared in advance. More improvised explosives, but these were different. These were designed to create maximum confusion rather than destruction. "Remember," Jin called to the dragons as they squeezed through the opening he had created, "we are not trying to destroy the prison. We are trying to make them think we are destroying the prison while we actually escape." Big difference. The dragons had spent the past week learning to think like humans, and now they understood the difference between force and strategy. Instead of burning everything in sight, they followed Jin's lead and applied their power with surgical precision. Other prisoners throughout the facility heard the explosions and alarms. They pressed against their cell bars and force fields, trying to see what was happening. What they saw terrified them more than any dragon attack ever could. Jin moved through the prison corridors like he had built the place himself. He knew exactly where every guard station was located, which doors led to dead ends, and which systems he needed to disable to create maximum chaos. He was not running or panicking. He was executing a military operation with the calm precision of someone who had planned for every possible variable. Behind him, the dragons followed his lead with growing amazement. When Jin said to melt this specific panel but not that one, they did it. When he told them to roar at exactly this moment to mask the sound of his lockpicking, they obeyed. They had become extensions of his strategic mind. "How is he doing this?" one prisoner whispered to another, as the unlikely team moved past their cells. "He is not escaping," the other replied with awe and terror in his voice. "He is conducting a symphony of destruction." Guards rushed toward them from 3 different directions, but Jin had anticipated this too. He had studied their response protocols during his week of observation. He knew they would split their forces and try to surround the dragons. He also knew this would leave their command center understaffed. "Flamewing, create a diversion at Junction 7, Jin called out calmly. "Deathclaw, disable the power grid exactly 60 seconds after Flamewing starts his attack. I will be back in 4 minutes. The dragons did as instructed, while Jin disappeared into the maze of service tunnels he had memorized from his wall diagrams. He moved through the prison's infrastructure like a ghost, appearing exactly where he needed to be at exactly the right moment. When the dragons regrouped with him at the hangar bay, Jin was already inside a stolen transport ship running pre-flight checks. He had not only escaped his cell and navigated the prison, but he had also somehow accessed the most secure area of the facility and prepared their getaway vehicle. "How did you learn to fly, alien spacecraft?" Deathclaw asked as they lifted off into space. "I did not," Jin replied. his hands steady on controls he had never seen before. But all spacecraft follow the same basic principles of physics. The rest is just figuring out which button does what before we crash into something. As they broke through the atmosphere and the prison fell away behind them, Flame Wing finally asked the question that had been bothering him for days. Jin, what happens when humans get truly angry? Not just annoyed or frustrated, but genuinely furious. Jin was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the star field ahead of them. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried a weight that made both ancient predators feel cold despite their internal fire. "You really do not want to find out," he said simply. "What you saw back there was not human anger. That was just human problem-solving. When humans get angry, we do not just escape from prisons. We come back with fleets and turn entire civilizations into cautionary tales." The dragons, who had destroyed worlds and terrorized galaxies, suddenly understood that they had encountered something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. They had learned to fear human ingenuity, human persistence, and human determination, but most of all, they had learned to be very grateful that this particular human considered them allies. Rather than enemies, the galaxy would never be quite the same.